other obsession is that I'm completely and fanatically devoted to the game of tennis. And I always have been. Since I was 4 years old, my first hero, it wasn't an astronaut, it wasn't, a local firefighter or any of the things that 4-year-old boys tend to have as heroes. My first hero was a Swedish tennis player, Bjorn Borg, who went on a tear in the 1970s and won 5 Wimbledons in a row from 1976 through to 1980. And that was my first hero. And my first career choice when I was about 5 or 6 years old was I was going to be Wimbledon champion. And I told everybody that. I told my parents that, my grandparents that, all my friends. They all knew that I was going to be Wimbledon champion. And the only problem was, and this is where my first heartbreak comes in, I wasn't good enough. I was never going to be good enough to be, not only was I not going to be Wimbledon champion, I wasn't going to win the local club tennis tournament. It just wasn't in my future. And I had to give up. I had to work out something else to do with my life, which is why I'm sitting in Sacramento these days writing about the heinous reality of Donald Trump land. But I never put tennis behind me. It was always this sort of hidden passion. And every year, since I moved to America 27 years ago, every year I've gone back to London in late June, early July, and I've had a ritual with my father, which is we'd sit down in our family house in Chiswick in West London, and we'd watch tennis together. We'd watch the Wimbledon Championship. If we were lucky, we'd manage to get some in-person tickets. And if we weren't so lucky, it didn't really matter because we'd sit in my parents' living room with a good glass of beer, and we'd watch tennis every day. And my son Leo is now 13, and he's also tennis obsessed. So we now have this 3-generation ritual of watching tennis. So anyways, a couple of years ago, I was in London, and it was after the tournament ended. And my son and I and a couple of friends went to Wimbledon to go on a behind-the-scenes tour. And it was one of those foul London summer days where it was raining so much you could hardly see anything. And we sat in the rain in centre court, getting soaked to our skin, while the tour guide gave us a sort of potted history of Wimbledon. And at the back end, they gave us tickets to go down into the basement museum. So we went down this spiral staircase, which is underneath the Wimbledon store, and spent an hour or so just going from one exhibit to another and looking at these Wimbledon champions of yore. And I thought I knew everybody. I thought, give me a tennis name and I will tell you who they were, when they won what, why they were important. But in one corner, there was this section on late Victorian early tennis players. And there was this little exhibit on a woman called Lottie Dodd. I'd never heard of her, never heard a thing about her, didn't know the name, didn't know her story. And it had just enough to pique my interest. It said that she'd won Wimbledon in the 1880s and early 1890s 5 times, and that she had first won when she was 15. Now, if any of you know anything about tennis, you'll know that nobody wins a Grand Slam tennis tournament at the age of 15. It's never been done, apart from once. The only person ever to win a Grand Slam tennis tournament at 15 was this young girl, Lottie Dodd, who grew up just outside the town of Liverpool, was born in 1871, and by the time she was 21 years old, had won Wimbledon 5 times. And she then disappeared from the world of tennis. She just walked out of the game, decided she wanted to try her hand at other sports. And I went back home to my parents' house and I thought about it. And I phoned the Wimbledon archives and I said, look, I'm a journalist, I'm in town for a few days. I'm really fascinated by this woman, Lottie Dodd. I don't know anything about her, but I'd love it if you could open up your archives. And they said, sure. So I spent much of the next week in the Wimbledon archives giving myself just terrible eye strain, looking at this very densely printed 19th century newspapers and sports journals and so on and so forth. And it was worth it because I realized at the end of that week, I had sort of almost by accident stumbled on one of the greatest untold sports stories in sporting history. And it turned out that Lottie Dodd wasn't just a good tennis player, she was a supremely good tennis player. But she was also one of the best golfers, hockey players, ice skaters, mountaineers, archers, and many other things. She was just this sporting polymath. And I spent the next 2 years going around the world to archives in Switzerland, in Norway, in the United States, in England, and obviously many, many, many online adventures as well, trying to piece together this woman's just truly remarkable life. And the more I found out about Lottie Dodd, the more I realized that it was both a miracle and a travesty that no one had written about her at biography length before. That of all the sporting figures in the last 150 years, Lottie Dodd's story was crying out for a full-length biography. And so I set my task to write the story of Lottie Dodd and to bring this forgotten character back into the public domain where she truly, truly belongs. So the story of Lottie Dodd is contained in this book, Little Wonder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a couple passages, the first from the introduction, and then I'm going to take you on a journey to the summer of 1888 and tell you a little bit more about Lottie Dodd at her tennis prime. And afterwards, I think we're going to bounce into a conversation, and Rowan's going to ask me, lots and lots of questions about what makes her relevant and so on. And then I very much hope, I don't know how many people we have, if any, in the broader audience out there, but I hope there are a number of you out there who will have questions that I'll be happy to answer for as long as you're willing to stay with me today. So this is from the introduction to Little Wonder. Charlotte Dodd, aged 88, was lying in her bed in the Birchy Hill nursing home in the sleepy southern England village of Sway. It was a peaceful place, quiet, as good as any other spot to spend one's final years. The village had a cluster of houses ranged along a few main streets, a handful of pubs, one church, St. Luke's, tennis and archery clubs, and a community choir, all surrounded by the oaks and other trees of the New Forest, England's last major acreage of densely wooded land. A few miles to the south were the genteel beach towns, the retirement communities and tourist resorts, dotting the windswept coast of the English Channel, towns with names such as Lymington and Milford-on-Sea, Barton-on-Sea and Bournemouth. Their streets were lined with elegant mock Tudor homes, their fronts cordoned off from prying eyes by tall hedgerows. Birchy Hill, with its white-painted brick facade and grey-tiled roof, with its brick chimneys and elegant curved window bays, had originally been built on a narrow country lane in the mid-1800s. As home to three spinster sisters, its grounds were spacious, with trim sloping lawns surrounded by trees and thick tangles of blackberry bushes that on one side muffled the street sounds and noises of the village beyond, and on the other served as the outer edge of the New Forest. During World War II, it had been requisitioned by the army. When the war ended, a male nurse who had served as a military ambulance driver and his wife bought the property, refurnished it with second-hand carpets, beds, and cupboards picked up on the cheap at estate sales, and opened up a retirement home that specialized in caring for elderly people with chronic physical or mental health conditions. Universally known as Lottie, the elderly woman who had had a move into Birchy Hill following a decline in her health was listening to a radio broadcast from the second Monday of the Wimbledon tennis tournament. She had been listening all of the previous week as well, through days plagued by squalls of rain and endless delays. It was for Dodd a sacred ritual. Almost certainly she had tuned in to every year of broadcasts since the BBC first began covering the event, by radio in 1927, by television 10 years later, in grainy black and white, available for only a few hours each afternoon. Year in, year out, since she had won her first ladies' championship back in Queen Victoria's Jubilee year of 1887, at the ludicrously young age of 15 years and 285 days, Lottie Dodd had made the journey out to the Wimbledon suburbs, first as a player, dubbed by the press Little Wonder, then as a fan. She won in 1887 and again in 1888. She took a break from the tournament for the following 2 years, but when she returned, still a teenager, she was once more unbeatable. The championship was hers in 1891, in 1892, and once more in 1893. In these years, Lottie Dodd would bicycle over to the courts from the nearby houses in which she stayed, quite simply made ladies' tennis a one-woman show. Though young in years, she is ripe in judgment, wrote the commentator W. Methven Brownlee in 1889 in his sweeping overview of the state of tennis. The Little Wonder exhibited, he continued, the temperament that is best described as that sweet calm which is just between. Frequently, in the decades after she retired, Dodd would bring her young nephews and nieces with her to sit in the front row seats that the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club allotted her, just behind the umpire's chair. When the weather heated out hot, she would take out her fan, black crenellated paper, topping a metal skeleton, decorated with gold floral arrangements and slightly racy portraits of 3 fleshy women, a bearded man with 2 devil-like horns watching them from off to their left, and gently fan herself. Dodd was always welcome back to tennis's self-proclaimed cathedral. After all, she had won the prestigious tournament 5 times before retiring at the age of 21 and moving on to other triumphs, to play hockey for the English team, to become the British ladies golf champion, to train in Switzerland as one of Europe's top ice skaters, reaching a level never before achieved by a woman, to master the most dangerous of toboggan runs, including the Swiss town of St. Moritz's notorious Cresta run, to summit a number of Norway and Switzerland's toughest mountains, and finally to win a silver medal for England in archery at the 1908 London Olympics. Writing back in 1903, the tennis critic A. Wallace Myers doubted he had, quote, yet seen her equal in ladies' tennis. She could jerk her opponents around the court like puppets with her forehand, and, observers noted, she volleyed aggressively with, as they put it, the self-confidence of a man. F.R. Burrow, who presided over Wimbledon as the tournament referee from 1918 to 1936, and who first started watching tennis in the 1880s, wrote in 1937 that so versatile was she, so talented at whatever sport she tried her hand at, that, quote, it is a pity that flying had not then been invented. I feel sure Miss Lottie Dodd would have been the first girl to make a solo flight around the world. Of all the women in sports who followed in Dodd's footsteps, the Guinness Book of World Records could only find one athlete in the succeeding century plus to compare her to, Babe Dickerson Zaharias, the great American sportswoman, born 40 years after Dodd, who in the years surrounding World War II competed and won at the highest levels in track and field, golf, basketball and baseball. In 1960, however, age had finally and fully caught up with Lottie Dodd. She had by that summer outlived all her siblings. Philip had died in early childhood. Anne, her first tennis partner, had died of cancer back in the 1920s. William had been dead 6 years now. And most recently, Anthony, with whom she had cycled around Europe in their youth and climbed some of the continent's highest peaks, to whom she had moved to Sway to be near, had died at the start of the year. Now, with the summer tennis season underway, Lottie Dodd herself was too sick to travel. She was suffering from bronchopneumonia and severe anemia, and had taken an awful fall in the nursing home, breaking her right femur and pelvis. To her caregivers, she was likely just another little old lady, burdened with ailments and with not too long to live. They probably felt sorry for her, saw how lonely and vulnerable she was, and shuddered inside, hoping that such a fate would not one day befall them, looking at her, so helpless, so pained, struggling for every breath. They probably couldn't imagine that she had ever been young, had ever been independent. How could they have known that she had once soared like a bird over mountains? That she had once, in riding the Cresta toboggan course in Switzerland, achieved higher speeds than had any other woman alive on Earth at that time? How could they have known that she had once stared into the jaws of massive glacial crevasses, and that she had, for years, graced the tennis courts of Wimbledon like no woman before and only a rare few after had done? How could they have known that, in her prime, the old lady could have staked claim to being the greatest sportswoman the world had ever seen? So that's from the introduction of Little Wonder, and I hope it gives you an overview of the magnitude of this Victorian lady's achievements, this person who just would not accept the glass ceiling and would not accept that there were any limits that society could or should impose upon her. And this sort of leads me to the second passage that I want to read to you from. You know, everybody's familiar, or most every sports fan is familiar with Billie Jean King against Bobby Riggs, the 1973 Battle of the Sexes, in which an ascendant Billie Jean King proved once and for all that women could compete on a tennis court or in any other sporting arena with men. And it's, you know, it's part of our cultural heritage at this point, that championship, that match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. It's entered the lexicon. There have been films made about it, documentaries made about it. You know, it's just this extraordinarily important moment. And, you know, without wanting to diminish that moment in any way, shape or form, I would like to note that 85 years earlier, in the high Victorian era, a 16-year-old Lottie Dodd challenged not just one male player, but three of the best male players of her age. She didn't challenge them when they were past their prime, like Bobby Riggs was past his prime. She challenged them when they were still playing and still winning. And it is an extraordinary moment in sports history. So the second passage I'm going to read to you, take yourself on a journey back in time to late Victorian England. And it's the summer of 1888. And historians out there will know that that same summer was the summer that Jack the Ripper was terrorizing the East End of London. And if you had opened a newspaper, the Times or any of the other big newspapers that summer, you would have seen on the front page story after story about Jack the Ripper and the terror that was being unleashed. But if you had turned to the sports pages, you would have seen that sports fans in Victorian England were still getting their fill of sports events and sports reporting. And if you've been paying attention, you would have read a series of articles about Lottie Dodd's latest achievements. So, let me take you on that journey to 1888. The summer of her second Wimbledon win in 1888, Lottie Dodd, now aged 16, invited three of the best male tennis players of her age to a series of sporting duels. This was a full 85 years before sport's most famous battles of the sexes, when in 1973 an aging Bobby Riggs challenged Billie Jean King to a tennis match and had his head very publicly handed to him on a plate in a bling-filled $100,000 winner-take-all globally televised match in the Houston Astrodome. The sporting world of the 1880s, the fans, the reporters, none had ever seen anything quite like what Dodd was proposing. In the Victorian imagination, such a matchup was almost inconceivable, a pairing that was fundamentally against the natural order. But the little wonder, flushed with her string of victories, supremely confident as to her abilities, believed that she could triumph. Harry Grove, a Londoner 9 years Dodd senior, had won the Scottish Championships in 1887 and reached the final again the next year. As for the Renshaw brothers, the twins, William and Ernest, they had utterly dominated Wimbledon since the start of the decade. William had won the tournament 6 times in a row from 1881, 6 months after the twins celebrated their 20th birthdays, to 1886, and would win one more championship in 1889. In his first win, William had demolished the reigning champion, the Reverend J.T. Hartley, 6-love, 6-1, 6-1 in a match that lasted only 37 minutes. It would establish a speed record for a Wimbledon men's final that has never since been beaten. Ernest had lost to his brother in several of the Wimbledon finals, but would partially redeem himself by winning the tournament in 1888. And the pair had combined into a formidable team that had won 5 Wimbledon men's doubles titles. Their matches routinely drew huge crowds and ecstatic commentary from sports reporters. All 3 men knew that their female opponent, Dodd, was a skilled player. Indeed, Ernest Renshaw had partnered with her over the previous year to win several major mixed doubles tournaments together. They had a good, friendly rapport. In Exmouth that summer, after Ernest and Lottie won a tournament, a friend's camera had caught them sitting on a bench, casually talking, Ernest was wearing white trousers, spats, a white shirt, checkered jacket, and a matching cravat. His face was dominated by a delicate moustache and intense, soulful eyes. Lottie was smiling, a rarity in her photos from the period. She looked relaxed, happy. The men Dodd challenged probably figured that the unorthodox contests could only bolster their already high profiles in the rapidly growing sports culture of the era, and so they eagerly accepted her throwdown. Despite Miss Dodd's already remarkable resume, the three gentlemen were confident that they could dispatch her with a minimum of fuss. After all, Lottie had 2 strikes against her. She was, quite obviously, a girl, and following on from that, she would have to wear long skirts and all the other clothing that made it so difficult for women athletes to move fast. Ernest Renshaw knew from first-hand experience that this was a hindrance, since he had once, on a dare, dressed up in women's clothing to play a friendly few games with the women's player Blanche Bingley. In fact, so bullish were the men that in an age in which many matches were played with handicaps, much like golf is today, they offered the girl what they assumed would be a sporting chance, something to keep the attendees a bit on edge before they put the girl in the awkward cricket cap back in her rightful, subservient place. Each game would, Grove and the Renshaws stated, in accepting the dare, begin with Dodd ahead 30-love. William had boasted that against any other woman he would even offer 40-love head starts, essentially meaning he'd have to win at least the first 3 points of every game in order to thread a path to victory. Dodd accepted the conditions. Dressed in an ankle-length white dress, the sleeves down to her wrists, the body of the dress up to the middle of her neck, with a corset underneath, her legs covered in thick black stockings, her feet clad in the sort of clunky black leather shoes worn by washerwomen, her head protected from the sun by a delicate white cricket cap. The little wonder employed her powerful forehand to the full, chasing down balls in the far corners of the court, charging the net whenever possible to end the rally with one of her signature, devastating volleys. For tennis cognoscenti, her game was something to marvel at. The tennis chronicler A. Wallace Meyer called her simply the incomparable Miss Dodd. In the first match, played in Northern England on the Monday following the end of a draining week-long tournament, the girl took on Ernest Renshaw. Local papers had heavily publicised the event, which was billed as a charity exhibition with ticket proceeds going to the local hospital dispensary, and with additional mixed doubles matches featuring the 2 stars thrown in as a bonus. Dodd won the first set at a dash, crushing her mixed doubles partner 6-2. But then, according to reports from the grounds, she flagged. Perhaps the week of tennis had caught up with her. Perhaps Renshaw, realising he had a real match on his hands, simply raised his game one vital notch. He perceived, a commentator acerbically reported, quote, that he had no ordinary lady opponent, and from that moment every stroke was keenly contested, both players doing their utmost to gain the victory. Whatever the reason, he won, but only just. The final score was 2-6, 7-5, 7-5. Newspapers noted the brilliancy of Dodd's play, the astounding hand-eye coordination she showed at the net. She ran her opponent around the court so hard, they wrote, that it almost seemed as if she were a man. Later that summer, in between regular matches at a tournament in Scarborough, the exhibitions resumed. First, the teenager wiped the floor with Harry Grove, beating him 1-6, 6-love, 6-3. Then she took on the 6-time Wimbledon champion, a man who for years had been the fiercest player on the lawn tennis circuit, a hero who travelled throughout the British Isles from one tournament to the next, routinely humbling his opponents. By the end of that match, Dodd had proven her point. In demolishing William Renshaw 6-2, 6-4, she had shown that women, those delicate, fragile flowers, of the Victorian imagination were more than capable of holding their own in the most physical of domains. The newspapers gush about her remarkable feats in taking down the best male players of her era. And I think that's where I'm going to end, at least for now. But I'd like to open it up to everyone to have this conversation about Lottie Dodd. And I hope that gives you, at least some sense of just how extraordinary this lady was and how important she was, not just in sporting history, but in putting out there that idea that there really shouldn't be glass ceilings. And if there are glass ceilings, the only thing they're good for is to be shattered. That's where I think I'm going to stop it, at least for now. Thank you all.
Sasha, thank you. That was so rich and fulsome. It's a wonderful chronicle. The thing about Lottie Dodd that comes out in your book is what an incredible polymath that she was. You're part of the story right here, leaves us with her triumphs in tennis. But of course, she left tennis after she won basically all there was to win and moved on to other sports, winter sports in Switzerland, field hockey, golf, even archery. We're of the same generation, so we must have both grown up with a bit of, well, maybe you didn't actually because you were in London, but ABC's Wide World of Sports, which famously talked about the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, at which point you'd see somebody coming down the slopes on skis, and, well, it didn't end up too well for them. I bring this up only because I would really love to hear you talk a bit about what happened to Lottie Dodd after she won. She won 5 Wimbledon championships, 87 at 15, as you said, 88, and then 91, 92, 93, at which point she moves on to other sports. Can you talk a little bit about what she decided to do after tennis? Because this is something that I think for those of you in the audience who are familiar with tennis, this is a theme we're familiar with, kind of the wonderkind who wonders, well, what's this all about? What else is there in the world?
I think that's sort of what fascinated me so much about Lottie Dodd, because as you said, we're familiar with these young players, male and female, who come in at a sort of precociously young age, and they do these amazing things, and then quite often they flame out. And you take Martina Hingis would be a case in point. She did these absolutely extraordinary things as a teenager in tennis, and then she had a real problem. It was too much pressure. It was too much being in the spotlight, and that happens quite often with sports figures. And in Lottie Dodd's case, even though it was before the TV era, before the paparazzi era and everything else, she was a superstar. She had, the media was following her everywhere. She had thousands of fans who would chant her name. She had this nickname, Little Wonder, and they would chant it wherever she went. Society magazines would write about her. Americans on the Grand Tour would come over across the Atlantic, and part of the Grand Tour in the 1880s and 1890s was try and find young Miss Lottie Dodd at a garden party and talk to her. And she became this sort of extraordinary larger-than-life figure. And the thing was, she could have gone on just winning and winning and winning at tennis. She was good enough. There was no other woman on the tour who could go anywhere near her when she was at her peak. In fact, in the entire time that she was playing these tennis tournaments, I could only find one match that she lost to another woman in a competitive tournament. So she was really in a league of her own. She could have just gone on doing all of this stuff. And she got bored, and she told her friends, I managed to find letters and, memoirs written by other people, years later. She told her friends that she had no desire to just keep accumulating trophies. It just didn't interest her to just stay at it because she was good enough. It bored her. And she had a personality, a temperament that I think needed constant stimulation. And so what she'd do is she'd become the champion at one sport, and then she'd walk away from it, and she'd do it with no regrets, and she'd try her hand at another sport. So you asked what she did. She went basically in the 1890s into golf one part of the year and winter sports another part of the year. And she went to a place called St. Moritz in Switzerland, which had sort of become the fashionable stopping point for European and American sort of society elites, military figures, artists, wealthy industrial barons, and so on. And she spent a few months a year there, and there were, these really eccentric adventurers there, and they were trying their hand at these newfangled sports like tobogganing, which had just been sort of invented, or mountaineering. And there have been mountaineers since the early 19th century. But in the late 19th century, there were women mountaineers. There was a woman called Elizabeth Maine in San Moritz. And all these characters befriended Lottie Dodd, and they started training her to do their sports. And so by 1896, you can find photographs of Lottie Dodd, again, in full Victorian regalia, you know, the long dress and everything else, carrying a parasol and walking on glaciers. And you can see her hanging on ropes from winter mountains, not peaks in summer. She was climbing some of the Alps' toughest mountains in the dead of winter. And, you know, it just absolutely fascinates me because, you know, she had no desire to take things easy. She had no desire to coast and to just do what she was good at. She had a sort of, there was this internal drive. If there was a challenge there, she would take the challenge. And if there was something that someone said to her, look, you can't do it, you're a woman, she would say, watch me do it. And then she did it. And, you know, it's quite remarkable to me. You know, she wasn't political. I didn't find evidence that she was a suffragette. But the suffragettes sort of were the backdrop here. They were making an increasing plea for equality. And they were making it as a very public plea. And there were demonstrations, there were acts of civil disobedience. There were even bombings and firebombings. There was a whole bunch of really sort of radical stuff going on in the 1890s and more particularly the early 1900s.
Including Center Court, right? As you point out in your book, or attempted bombings of Center Court, right?
Exactly. You know, these women would go at the dead of night. They were non-violent. They didn't try and hurt people when they were at these sports events, but they'd go to arenas at the dead of night and they would set them on fire. And then they would leave suffragette literature there saying, you know, the suffragettes demand the right to vote, essentially. And this was done at tennis events. It was done at horse shows. It was done at a variety of different boat clubs, you know, public places where they knew it would get a lot of attention. And, you know, Lottie Dodd, I don't think she was political, although she did register to vote the minute she could register to vote. You know, she absolutely believed in women having a role in the public domain. But I think she was waging a one-woman war from the time she was a teenager onwards against notions of female fragility and against notions of inequality of the sexes. And the way she was able to do this, she had money, she didn't have to work for a living. The way she was able to do this is she would basically take challenges, and when male athletes said you can't do it, or when male sports writers said you can't do it, or when male doctors said don't do it, because there was this whole medical literature in the late 19th and early 20th century about how strenuous physical activity was dangerous to women. And doctors would write about how it would cause infertility because it would damage the reproductive system. And psychiatrists would write about how it would convert women into what they called inverts. And that was a word used at the time. It meant lesbian. And there was this notion in sports literature that excessive physical training would turn a woman into a lesbian. And so there was, you know, all of this public literature out there discouraging women from being athletes, and there was all of this popular prejudice out there discouraging women from being athletes. And Lottie Dodd basically said, not only am I going to compete on my own terms, but I'm going to take it up to the level of the men. And so she would challenge male tennis players, or she would take the male ice skating tests in Switzerland because the female skating test was seen as too easy for her. Or she was told, you can't go down the toboggan course, the Cresta toboggan run, it's too difficult. So she did it, and she was the first woman ever to go down that toboggan run. And then shortly afterwards, the grandees of the toboggan course said, we don't want women doing this. And they banned women. And women weren't re-invited onto the Cresta run until 6 months ago, until late 2019. That was the first time that women were re-invited in. So she's basically doing stuff 100 years ahead of her time. I just think it's completely fascinating.
So going back to, this notion of boredom or ennui, which I think her response to it is in and of itself a type of political act, right? That there is something beyond the void or doing nothing as a response to boredom or ennui. But also this notion of failure and defeat. Things didn't go as well for her after quite an audacious beginning in her golf career. It didn't really take off the way that, say, winter sports and tennis seemed to be so easy for her. She won the national championship in Troon, Scotland, as you pointed out. And I was just wondering, because I feel like you really lay out some of the difficulty of carrying the burden of being Lottie Dodd in the golf minuet in the book. I was wondering if you could also maybe read a little snippet of that, where Lottie Dodd comes to America. You point out that she's already been heralded because of her triumph at Troon, being the British women's golf champion. There's a lot of expectation. This also is, I think, maybe a window into Lottie Dodd preparing us for the contemporary athlete. She arrives and an audience already knows who she is and wants to see her perform. And I was thinking maybe from the bottom of page 147, that section, if you could maybe read a bit of that, because I think that it would provide a nice chiaroscuro to the burden of being Lottie Dodd.
No, absolutely. And, you know, your question about the ennui that she felt in the board, this sort of boredom, you know, I think it goes to the heart of who she was. And I think in a way it goes to the heart of the sort of late Victorian adventurer, these people of independent wealth. Lottie Dodd came from a family where the father had made an absolute fortune as a cotton merchant. He was
We're going to get to that.
Right, so I'll hold off on that. But, you know, she was a woman who had the means to experiment. She wasn't constrained by circumstance. And, you know, what that meant was do anything she wanted, basically, at least until World War I. I think it's a little bit different afterwards. Her family finances, you know, for various reasons, become more precarious in the World War I, post-World War I period. But there were certainly many, many decades where she could do what she wanted. And what it meant was, you know what, she would do a sport for a while, then she'd move on, she'd do something different, she'd do something different again. And it wasn't just sport. You know, at a certain point, she decided too old for sport. She was in her late 30s, she moves on. She becomes a volunteer nurse in World War I, and then she becomes a madrigal singer, singing classical music at, you know, some of the best concert halls in London. And she sort of has this very eccentric, individualistic approach to life. And so I think the ennui and this sort of need to push it off, this need to always do something new, is in a sense the leitmotif from start to finish, from the time she was a very young girl to the time she was a very old lady. But you're absolutely right that, you know, it wasn't all easy for her because, you know, she was used to turning her hand to a sport and everything going right, and suddenly, you know, she's the top of the game. And, you know, for a while, that's what happened with golf. For a while, she really was. She dominated the championships in England in 1904. She won a whole bunch of other championships. She was written about by all the golf journals, not just in England, but in Canada, in the United States, in Australia. You know, she was really a global presence at this point. And she gets convinced to come over to the United States. You know, some of her friends who she's known for about 10 or 15 years from, you know, the time when there were young American ladies coming in the 1890s to, you know, touch and talk to the young Miss Lottie Dodd, they convinced her to come west. So she takes a boat west, she takes a steamship west, and she basically books herself this incredibly labor-intensive tour of the United States and Canada. And, you know, it starts off the way it's supposed to start off. She comes to the States, she arrives in Philadelphia, and the first few days, everything's going smoothly and she's winning everything. And then things go wrong, and she enters a tournament. I think it's the US National Championships, actually. She enters a tournament, and she is beaten by a young unknown who is not supposed to in any way, shape, or form beat her. And it's really difficult for her for a couple of reasons. The first is she just does not like losing. She's really competitive. But the second thing is the media in America turn on her. And they turn on her in the way the media often does when a hero or a heroine trips over their own feet. They turn on her as sort of someone who's getting a little bit of a comeuppance. And they write really nasty articles sort of mocking her, saying that she's, you know, a delicate English lady and she can't take the American climate and she can't take the American continent and she can't take the American competition, and they really go after her. So I'll read you a passage from that period in her life. In the wake of all the hoopla following Lottie Dodd's victory at Troon, American readers and sports enthusiasts became obsessed with the English sensation. Papers across the country published newswire stories on her triumphs, and many commissioned their own reporters to write up profiles of the tall, poised lady from across the pond who somehow didn't seem to know how to lose. Society ladies who had befriended Dodd during their sojourns in Switzerland and England, clamored for her to come visit them in the United States. Dodd vacillated. Having conquered yet another sport, she was tempted to return to her roots in competitive tennis, she confided to several friends, and she sought their advice as to whether to play Wimbledon again that summer, 11 years after her last victory there. Several were enthusiastic, believing she could pick up where she had left off and resume her string of triumphs. From Brussels, Charles Voigt wrote to express the hope that you will do as well at Wimbledon in a fortnight's time. I regret I shall not be able to be there this year to see you play. Others, however, cautioned her not to do it. Her cousin Alfred Higgins sat down at his desk in his Belsize Park house in North London and wrote a long, thoughtful letter in which he concluded, "As regards lawn tennis, if I were you, I would rest my laurels, which are ample. I would not like you to lose, and on the other hand, I see nothing to be gained by winning. As everyone knows, you could have gone on for year after year, winning the championship if you had cared to." Now, Dodd listens to those voices of caution, and she comes out to America, and she starts playing these tournaments. So I'm going to take you to the moment at which she starts wobbling a little bit. Facing a young American golfer, Pauline McKay, in the first round, Dodd just about held her own as they navigated the course. But uncharacteristically, she found it impossible to pull ahead. By the 17th hole, she was beginning to fade. A rumour spread through the crowd. The great English golfing sensation was about to lose. Huge numbers of people flooded in to watch them play the hole. McKay opened with a long and accurate drive. Dodd prepared her response. But incredibly, when she swung, the English ladies champion made a rookie's error. She sclaffed her tee shot, the club scraping the ground awkwardly before making contact with the ball, its core rubber, its outer gutta percha, of a kind patented by the American inventor Coburn Haskell only 5 years previously. As a result, the ball landed on the far edge of the bank, far from the hole. 2 shots later, McKay sank her own ball in and won the match. The story was sent out by telephone and telegraph all the way across the country within hours. Papers as far afield as San Francisco were trumpeting Dodd's shocking loss. In defeat, it seemed, Dodd held the attention of the American media as much as she had earlier in victory, becoming something of a foil as the newspapermen reported on the exploits of the up-and-coming youngster who had improbably brought her to heel in the opening round. Miss Pauline McKay, a young golfer barely out of her teens and hailing from the Oakley Country Club, Boston, was the heroine of yesterday's play in the championship tournament of the United States Golf Association over the links of the Merion Cricket Club at Haverford, wrote a reporter for the Trenton Times in New Jersey somewhat gleefully. She defeated Miss Lottie Dodd, the British title holder, in a match replete with sensational incidents. The Topeka State Journal out of Kansas attempted to smooth out the wrinkles, charitably putting Dodd's loss down to the foul weather. But even in this, the author managed to make Dodd look mediocre, a vulnerable English girl unable to adjust to the vicissitudes of the American climb. It was, the journalist noted, one of those warm autumn days that enervate even Americans who are used to them. Miss Dodd, dressed for the cool weather she would have encountered at home in autumn, was oppressed by the heat and rendered languid and nerveless. Had it been a cool, bracing day, he continued, she would have made a better fight. And it sort of goes on. You get the idea. She really was sort of taken apart by the press.
Sure, this is a wonderful inversion of, you know how the English would say for years about Lionel Messi. Well, that's great. He scored a hat trick against Real Madrid, but can he do it on a cold Tuesday night at Stoke, right? But it's inverted this way. Of course, Lottie Dodd, being the marvel that she was, picked herself up and then picked up archery and won the silver medal in the 1908 Olympics in London. Truly a remarkable athlete with really
So, side note there, she won at the same time that her brother William won the gold medal in archery, and it was the first brother-sister Olympic medal partnership in the Olympic Games in the modern Olympic era.
So Sasha, let me ask you, Is this why Lottie Dodd was not a household name? Do you think that this innocent slip up in front of our ravenous American audience was the reason we don't know more about her? Why don't we know more about Lottie Dodd? And let me follow that up with another question. Now that you're introducing us to Lottie Dodd, or reintroducing us in 2020, in a year that Eric, once again, so poignantly put as being, to put it mildly, problematic, what does knowing Lottie Dodd give to us now as we look at the world as it is, not just in sports, but just in a kind of a global sensibility and context? Where can we go with her, with this story?
They're both great questions. And I think, the reason Lottie Dodd isn't more well known, I think it's probably less to do with what happened in America and more to do with two or three other things. So, the first of them is she was just a little bit before electronic media. So, there's 30 seconds of her in the Pathé archives in the British Film Institute. There's 30 seconds of her in the 1908 Olympics shooting off her bow and arrow. And there's 1 minute from her in 1926 when she was middle-aged, accepting a medal from the King and Queen at a Jubilee ceremony at Wimbledon that was for all past champions. But there's nothing of her in her prime. So there's, lots and lots of really beautiful still photography. But there's no moving images. And I think moving images in sports help sort of create, much more of a sort of durable historical presence.
Well, this is why we know Helen Wills so well, and Susan Langland, of course. We've seen them play each other.
Exactly. Susan Langland, Helen Mills, there are people who were there not very much after her, but maybe 10 or 20 years after, and contemporaries would compare them. They'd say that, Lottie Dodd played as well as Helen Mills Moody or Suzanne Langland, but there's moving images of her. So I think that's one thing, is that she was just a bit too early. And the other thing is she was a woman, and even though she had a huge fan following at the time, there still was, a tremendous amount of sexism, and especially over time, sports historians have diminished the achievement of women athletes in the late 19th century and played up the achievement of, male contemporaries such as William Renshaw, who was much more of a sort of sporting figure in the world of sports history. The thing about relevance to today, obviously we're in a moment where we feel constrained, where things that we have taken for granted are no longer, let's hope only temporarily, but really not possible. And, there's that sense of our world having been turned upside down, and it's discombobulating. It doesn't matter if you're an academic or a journalist or, whatever one is, it's discombobulating to live through this moment and feel that things we took for granted are no more. And I think it's particularly important in a moment like that, like this, to really, really understand the power of stories of people who say, I can do something. Of people who say, it doesn't matter what the limits are. It doesn't matter how circumscribed conditions may seem to be. It doesn't matter if an entire world is out there saying you can't do something. At the end of the day, if you have heart and soul, you can do something. And I think that's the lesson I take, is that, this is far more than a sporting story. It's far more than a tennis story. This is a story of human achievement and of human possibility and of beating the odds, whatever those odds might be. And I find it deeply inspiring.
Well, that's really wonderful, Sasha. And your book is really marvelous. For me also, it's incredible because as a tennis lover, it changes the span of the timeline. Now I think about going from Lottie Dodd to Serena and the wonderful similarities and differences in their stories and trajectories. As a great lover of the game, past and present, its history and its traditions, I'm really grateful to you for that, Sasha. And I'm really grateful for you also so eloquently putting why the story of someone born in Bevington in 1871, 2 years before lawn tennis was even invented, is so relevant to us in these really trying days. Sasha, it's been really wonderful talking with you, hearing from you about Little Wonder. Remember that you can pick this up anywhere. If only we could be together and have you sign it. But also, what were you going to say?
Hey, one day we will, and one day we will play tennis together.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that. You left out being left-handed. I feel like
yes.
That's also a wonderful part of this story. Long live the left-handers. Please go get this book, whether you're interested in sports, culture, gender, history, the past, and certainly the present. by Sasha Abramsky, Little Wonder. Sasha, it's been wonderful. Thank you. Eric, Ari, Zari, Sam, everyone at IPK, and of course all of you who tuned in for this wonderful, wonderful event. Thank you. Sasha, any last words?
I'd just like to reiterate what you just said. A huge, huge thank you to all of you who helped put this together, and wishing we were all together in person instead of thousands of miles apart in our various Zoom attics. But it was a real joy. Thank you all.
Here, here. Game, set, and match.
Cheers.
Cheers. Take care, everyone.